like to welcome you all here tonight for a discussion this evening. The borders here, Bloomington and Monroe County. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to ask everybody to turn their cell phones off. And my name is Jane Grant, and I'm going to be the moderator for this evening. This forum is the work of the Immigration. Is this not on? Okay. This forum is the work of the Immigration Justice Task Force, which is a partnership of religious organizations, civic organizations, and an assorted group of individuals, diverse individuals across Bloomington and Monroe County. We're pleased that in attendance this evening we have elected officials, the faith community, businesses, and individuals from across the county. The forum is being live streamed on YouTube, and it's also being videotaped by the library to be placed in their archives. The camera will focus only on the presenters. Nobody else will be photographed. Our discussion this evening will be divided into 5 parts. Our first presenter will be Professor Ellen Wu. She's an associate professor of history at Indiana University. She's going to provide an overview of immigration issues, policies, and conflicts in the United States. Our second presenter is Christy Popp. She's an immigration attorney with Popp and Bowman Attorneys at Law, and she's going to provide us with a close-up view of how the Monroe County Sheriff, the actions of the sheriff and the policies of the sheriff are directly and negatively affecting individuals and families in this community. Our third presenter is Michael Montesano. He's a graduate student in comparative literature at Indiana University. He's a board member of Undock Hoosiers, Bloomington. He's going to read a statement by David, who is a client of Christie's. David is a local Bloomington resident. He couldn't be here tonight, but he wanted to share his story. He wanted you to understand the harm that the sheriff's policy is causing to immigrants. David has lived here for 19 years. He's married with 2 children, his family, and they own their own home. He was in the process of getting his green card when he was arrested. ICE picked him up at the jail, and now he has a deportation case pending. While we all hope that he will win and can stay and live here with his family, such an outcome is not guaranteed. Our fourth presenter will be Christy Popp again, and she's going to discuss some direct and simple actions that hopefully citizens will want to take to address this to local officials, to newspapers, to really bring out the issue of the violations of the Fourth Amendment and its protections against unreasonable search and seizure that really are not being honored by the Sheriff's Department. Finally, our discussion will be followed by your questions and input, which is really vital to this whole forum. Please limit your questions to 5 minutes, and you can either come up to the microphone, which will be there, and ask your questions directly, or if you prefer, you could use the index card and write a question out, and Gracie is right there. Thank you. She will collect the questions, and I can read them for everybody. We also want to thank the library for their help in making this forum possible. The rules of the library state that abusive, threatening, or harassing behavior in any form is prohibited. We expect, of course, that this will be a respectful and civil discussion in this public space. I want to thank the members of the Immigration Justice Task Force for all the work and contributions they have made to this forum, and special thanks to the members of the Forum Planning Subcommittee who have worked so hard on this project. So let's begin. I'll introduce again Ellen Wu, and she will provide us a historical context for immigration policy in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to stand because I'm more used to standing. I want to thank all of you for coming out on a dark and rainy night. And I won't take too much of your time, but I thought I would just start off start us off tonight by sharing a few key historical examples to highlight how today's commonplace assumptions about, quote unquote, the border or enforcement, also in scare quotes, are really not natural or timeless. Okay? So I've got three major takeaways. First is that the border is something that has been intentionally built, maintained, and justified by policymakers and ordinary citizens alike. Second is that the border goes beyond the literal geospatial line between the United States and Mexico. For immigrants considered threatening, the border is already everywhere, and it keeps growing. And my third major point for tonight is that immigrants from particular places encounter harder borders designed to exclude them from American society. And that exclusion began and persists as a significant form of racial profiling. So I hope that my historical context will help us tonight to understand more fully how and why certain groups of people today are the most targeted by immigration enforcement authorities. And I'm going to focus in particular on the tangled threads of race and border control in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the United States last experienced a huge swell of mass immigration, not unlike today. And the actions taken by Americans then still have high-stakes implications for us today. Okay, so just as a very quick kind of 101. Before the late 19th century, border control, as we think about it, looked very different than it does today. Since the colonial period, individual states and towns, including Indiana, passed laws to prevent enslaved and runaway African Americans, freed African Americans, and poor people of all races from entering and settling in their communities. But for the most part, immigrants and refugees from abroad came and went with few restrictions. Now, by the 1870s and 1880s, large numbers of immigrant workers started coming to the United States from unfamiliar places, China and Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, white people, who were mostly what we would call WASPs, but also some Irish Catholics and others, were troubled by these newcomers, all of whom they did not consider white. And they blamed these newcomers for the ills that were sparked by the spread of capitalism, industrialization, and urbanization. Okay, to address these so-called problem migrants, the United States began to implement the border control system that we live with today. In 1882, Congress passed the first of a series of Chinese exclusion acts, which banned the entry of Chinese workers into the US, allowed for their deportation of those who are already present without authorization, and also barred Chinese from naturalized citizenship. I think it's important for us to note that, you'll see here on that bottom note, that the Supreme Court upheld Chinese exclusion in 1889, ruling that Congress had the supreme or sovereign power to decide which aliens, their term, got admitted or excluded from the United States. The justices cited national security and the insurmountable differences between Chinese folks and white people to justify their ruling. So what we have here is that Chinese exclusion really laid the foundation for America's modern border control system in terms of its underlying logic and practices. Okay, I think of Chinese exclusion as the prototype. The underlying logic of Chinese exclusion remains alive today in immigration enforcement, and that is that racial, religious, and cultural difference threatens the well-being of the American people, and that the federal government rightfully has the authority to regulate our borders to keep out these threats. So again, Chinese exclusion provided the prototype for the US's modern system of immigration enforcement. And once Congress banned Chinese laborers from entering the country, they created the problem of what some people call illegal immigration. Now, Chinese understood exclusion to be unjust form of racial profiling, and they continued to come to the United States despite the exclusion bans. They often did so using false documents and slipping quietly through the United States-Canada or the US-Mexico borders. So to monitor and deter Chinese immigrants who were widely stereotyped as sneaky, as deviants, as criminals, the federal government created a surveillance system. Okay, so the first government-issued photo IDs, like the one you saw on the last slide, mandatory registration. They deployed what were called Chinese inspectors to patrol the US-Mexico border. So those were the first people that were to be kept out at the US-Mexico border. And they conducted raids and made arrests in interior regions and deported the Chinese who were already present. So for Chinese immigrants during the exclusion period, the border was effectively everywhere. The practices of Chinese exclusion then expanded to target other undesirable groups. Turn-of-the-century nativists, or what I consider immigrant haters, agitated against the hordes, again, quote unquote, from Southern and Eastern Europe. The immigrants, most of whom were Catholics and Jews, and often suspected of being anarchists and radicals. WASPs of the time considered these groups also not fully white. And in 1924, nativists got their wish, turning again to the law. Congress passed the 1924 Immigration Act that effectively cut off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. So this is a political cartoon of the time, and you can see the teeming hordes of Europe trying to get in, and everybody's trying to push their way into a very narrow funnel, right, that Uncle Sam is monitoring. I should say notably, once this restriction was put into place, considerable numbers of European immigrants crossed the border without authorization or overstayed their visas. But they were never federal authorities' primary concern, since they were white-ish, or white adjacent, okay? So people that, Italians, Greeks, Poles, so forth. Now, federal authorities also applied the Chinese exclusion template towards Mexican immigrants, albeit with some major tweaks. Okay, this is from 1915. This is the border at Sonora and Arizona, Nogales. The grand irony, of course, and this is why I have this picture up, is that the American Southwest was once part of Mexico. And even after the Southwest became part of the United States, people moved freely around the region as they had always done. So uninhibited border crossing was an everyday occurrence, something people just took for granted, walking across a street or across a bridge. As migration streams from Europe and Asia slowed in the 1910s and 20s, migration from Mexico picked up to meet labor demands. Migrants were also fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. Now, nativists, not surprisingly, were outraged. They viewed Mexicans as ignorant, as filthy, as lazy and criminal, threats to the nation's well-being. So Mexicans soon found themselves the target of immigration enforcement. I think it's important to note that the 1924 Immigration Act actually did not impose quotas, immigration quotas, on Mexico. But nativists and the federal government found other ways to deter Mexican immigrants. They applied strict screening criteria, such as expensive entry fees, literacy tests, and then also judgments if someone was likely to become a public charge, that is to go on the dole, or had an unclean appearance, okay? So you can see here, under the guise of medical inspections, they subject Mexican migrants to humiliating baths and strip searches. And the 1924 Act also required, for the very first time, that all immigrants from everywhere obtain valid visas. So to avoid these burdens, and they really were burdens, Mexican immigrants often chose to cross the border at unsanctioned points, thus entering without authorization, even though there was no quota against Mexico. So as with Chinese exclusion, border regulations targeted Mexican migrants, and that created the problem of quote-unquote illegal immigration. So one other important aspect of the 1924 Immigration Act deserves mention, and that is that the law stipulated that deportation would be the consequence for unauthorized immigration. The law also lifted the statute of limitations on deportation, meaning that unauthorized immigrants always face the penalty of removal. Okay, so Congress was pretty busy in 1924. That year, it also established the Border Patrol. Now, the Border Patrol really began, again, to keep Chinese from coming into the US, but by 1924, it continued that emphasis at the US-Mexico line, but also widened its scope to police drug and alcohol trafficking and European and Mexican migrants. And soon enough, as you might predict, Mexican migrants became the Border Patrol's primary targets, and deportation became a primary tool to deal with what Americans thought of as the Mexican problem. From its earliest days, the Border Patrol thought of its mission as one of catching criminals, even though, as I think Christy Pop will explain, technically, immigration enforcement fell into the realm of civil law, not criminal law. And just as important, Border Control considered the border anywhere within the interior of the United States. So for Mexican immigrants, the border was effectively everywhere. Okay, so just one final example. And so the point about the border being everywhere, indeed, in the 1930s, the federal government embarked on a mass deportation campaign, an effort that authorities tried to gloss as repatriation. Okay? Basically, kicking out Mexicans was a way for the government to show the American people that is the federal government was doing something about immigration and immigrants who took away American jobs during the Great Depression. Federal officials and local law enforcement frightened some 400,000 Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, born in the United States, to leave for Mexico. It's a history that we don't often remember today. So this is actually an image from that mass expulsion period of family and friends waving goodbye to their loved ones in Los Angeles in 1931. So these early examples remind us that our country approaches immigration through a set of assumptions that are relatively recent, but also deeply entrenched now. And if history shows us that the border as a racial profiling mechanism has to be intentionally built and maintained and justified by policymakers and ordinary citizens alike, history also suggests that policymakers and ordinary citizens alike have the power to do the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Christy Pop, who's going to address the issues that we are now seeing manifested locally that have historical connections. Thank you.
Thank you. So Professor Wu explained perfectly the problem with immigration enforcement. It has never really been about protecting the border. Border protection means only keeping the wrong sort of people out, and usually those are people of color. In the past 2.5 decades, our laws and policies have targeted these groups even more directly. And specifically, our laws and policies have been amended and changed to affect Mexicans and Central Americans more than any other group. The animosity has never been greater since President Trump took office. From the first day of his campaign, he's maligned Mexicans and furthered racist tropes about their danger and the danger that those immigrants pose to us. We have all heard what is happening at the border and the lengths to which this administration is fighting to keep Mexicans and Central Americans out of our country. The Return to Mexico program, the family separations, and the useless and expensive border wall. But in fact, the border is here. Deportations from our community are happening. Family separations are happening here. And some of our elected law enforcement officials are helping ICE in this terrible operation. For the past decade, ICE has slowly moved its targeted enforcement and removal operations to local and county jails around the country. And on its face, this may seem like an easy way to dragnet the bad hombres and get them out of the country. What we have found, though, is that immigrants of color, like all people of color, are disproportionately impacted by these policies. Immigrants of color are more likely to be subject to racial profiling in policing. They are often picked up for minor crimes like driving without a license and arrested for those sorts of things when white people would not be. And ICE is using this opportunity to extract them from the community, even if they were picked up after being racially profiled, or even if they were mistakenly arrested, even if their arrest was a low-level offense, and even if they've never been convicted. So tonight I'm going to talk about ICE enforcement at our local jail, assisted by our local sheriff. And I want to be clear from the beginning that I'm not against enforcement of our criminal laws. And I think that if you commit a crime or you're found guilty of DUI, for example, you should serve your time, whatever the judge deems appropriate. But I fundamentally think that if you're arrested for a DUI, the consequence should be jail or probation, not permanent separation from your family, and not exile to a country you hardly remember. That is what we're talking about here today. We're talking about our neighbors who at any moment may lose everything that they have worked for. We're talking about our neighbors' children, the children at our local schools, who suffer from constant anxiety that their parents may be gone at any moment. They know that their mom's drive to work may cause her to be deported forever. There are other problems with the sheriff's policies. They raise constitutional problems, they cost our county money, and they open us up to the potential for major litigation. But we don't want lawsuits here. We want the sheriff to do what is right, which is to stop helping the Trump administration deport our neighbors. And if he won't do it on his own, then we want the Monroe County government to take whatever actions are necessary to prevent him from doing any more. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time explaining exactly what is happening here locally and going into more depth about the problems. The first thing I want you to know is that immigration enforcement is not criminal enforcement. A crime has a victim. Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's somebody else and the state. A crime results in procedures in our criminal justice system, like an arrest or a prosecution, a hearing before a judge, due process, and a punishment. But immigration laws are administrative laws. Those are civil laws. And when we're talking about immigration enforcement, we're talking about enforcement of civil laws. Violations of civil laws result in civil consequences, and in immigration, the ultimate one is deportation. Being unlawfully present in the United States is not a crime. Being deportable and inside the United States is not a crime. So don't be fooled by the fact that ICE enforcement is happening at our jail. ICE is there because that's an easy way to get people, not because they're doing anything related to criminal enforcement. I don't think these people are the police. They may put that label on their vests, but immigration, ICE, they are not the police. So our local sheriff is working with ICE. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going a bit into detail of how he's working with ICE. I know it may be a little boring, but I hope you bear with me. So the process for ICE to pick up people in the jail happens in two ways. First is through the ICE detainer program, which is also called an ICE hold, and I often will use both interchangeably. So in that case, ICE informs the jail that they suspect a person in the jail is unlawfully present or deportable, and then the jail will hold that person. The second way is through the sheriff's own actions. Sheriff calls ICE to inform them that a foreign national is in jail. So here's a little background about how the ICE detainer system works. When a person is arrested and booked into jail, they are fingerprinted and they give their place of birth. That information is put into a national database, and there are ICE officers who monitor those databases at all hours of the day. The The information then is run through several government databases, and based on whatever comes up or doesn't come up, ICE will issue a detainer. Often, having a foreign place of birth and no record in a database is enough for ICE to issue a detainer. Sometimes, having a very common Hispanic name is enough for ICE to issue a detainer. ICE will inform the jail about the detainer, and then the jail will hold that person up to 48 business hours. So what that means that weekends and holidays are not included. A person picked up on a Friday before a long holiday weekend will be held until Wednesday. An ICE hold is not mandatory. It's a request. The federal government cannot mandate that the state and local officials do anything. And even ICE makes it clear that this is a request. The jail chooses whether or not to honor the hold. And the important point is that the hold only applies when the person can be released from jail. That means that the charges have been dropped, or the person was released on his own recognizance, or he paid the bail, or was found not guilty. In all of these scenarios, a judge or the system has found that the person is not a danger or a risk to our community. And so again, we're talking about mostly people who've been arrested for low-level offenses. And another important point is that a detainer is not an arrest warrant. So immigration offenses are not crimes. Since it's not an arrest warrant, it never has, an immigration official does not need probable cause to issue it, and it never has judicial review. A low-level ICE agent looking at a computer signs this form to hold somebody on suspicion of being unlawfully present, and it never gets reviewed. Since the ICE hold only takes effect when the person may be released, if he can't pay the bail that was set, he just sits in jail, and the hold never takes effect. That can take several months to a year, depending on how long it takes to proceed. And this is also important because our local bail bondsman won't even help pay the bail for someone who might be subject or is subject to an ICE hold. That means that we are paying all of this money to house and feed detainees in jail just because they can't pay the bail. The second way that the sheriff is helping work with ICE is by calling immigration on a foreign national who's booked into jail. Now the sheriff he says he only calls when the person has been accused of serious offenses. But I still have problems with this. Mainly, the sheriff is not trained in immigration law. He doesn't know when someone is deportable. He doesn't know if someone is a citizen. The courts have said over and over, including the Supreme Court, that local law enforcement is not permitted to conduct immigration enforcement except in very narrow circumstances where they have been trained and supervised by ICE. And the reason is clear. Immigration is complicated, and the immigration statuses are fluid. They change. It can be hard to tell when somebody is a citizen or not, especially if they present as being a foreign national. So basically, the sheriff has no training, and he's calling ICE merely based on a person's suspected national origin or ethnicity. He is calling after a person has been booked in jail. That means that person has been accused of a crime. But even foreign nationals have a presumption of innocence. So here's an example. This is a comment the sheriff made publicly on his Facebook page, and I'm going to highlight the portion. He says, "Today, a young man from an Asian country was booked into jail for stabbing a young girl. Yes, ICE will be notified." Look, what that kid was accused of doing was a horrible crime, but the fact is he was not deportable, and ICE did not put a hold on him. The sheriff, with no training in immigration law, was calling ICE on him because he was from an Asian country. That's called racial profiling. So beginning last summer, the sheriff made a series of public announcements and was interviewed by the local paper about his policies. He has been publicly denying that he honors ICE holds. And he says he hands foreign nationals over only when they've had serious charges pending, like murder. So I'm going to walk you through some of the sheriff's statements and how he describes his program. First, he says that in the absence of a serious federal crime allegation, an individual will not be detained on an immigration detainer. I highlighted federal crime allegation because that's the only time you will see that referenced here. That is not the standard the sheriff is applying. He said that the jail holds people who are facing allegations of serious offenses ranging from drug dealing to murder. But ICE says that between 2011 and 2019, only one person was picked up on a hold from the Monroe County Jail with a sex offense conviction. There were no other serious violent offenses. The sheriff said there are some exceptions, such as when someone jailed on a minor charge is being actively sought and flagged by the immigration police. Guys, he's talking about an ICE hold. That's what he's saying. He's saying when ICE places a hold, then I honor that. And don't forget, there's no such thing as the immigration police. Finally, the sheriff says if they are charged with a DUI, shoplifting, or a minor crime, we don't notify ICE. ICE says that between 2011 and 2019, these are the top 5 convictions for which people were removed from the Monroe County Jail. Number 1, larceny, that's shoplifting. Number 3, no conviction. Number 4, traffic offense. And number 5, driving under the influence. I don't think the sheriff was telling the full story when he was making those comments. So who is the sheriff handing over? He's handing over people who a judge has already ruled may be released from the county jail. Foreign nationals who are convicted of murder, rape, and other serious offenses are transferred to prison, and they serve their time in prison. We are talking about our neighbors who are arrested, potentially after racially being profiled, for minor offenses. ICE is deporting our community's fathers and husbands, sons and brothers, and women too, some mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters. But ICE is separating families in our community, and the sheriff is helping. So there are several problems, and I'm going to highlight them very quickly. Many courts that have looked at the issue have found that immigration detainers are constitutionally problematic. First, they are based on faulty database searches. This was a decision from this past September in federal court in LA. And the judge found that ICE detainers violated the 4th Amendment with the use of their databases because the databases were so faulty. So to illustrate how faulty these databases are, across the country, thousands of natural-born citizens have had ICE holds. It's happened in Marion County, and one of my clients was picked up in Morgan County. Here are a few highlights. One American held for 4 years. The Cato Institute found that ICE issued detainers on an estimated 3,500 citizens in Texas between 2006 and today. The ACLU found that more than 400 citizens had detainers in Rhode Island. Hundreds more citizens had detainers in Florida and California. And these are just a few examples. Second, courts have found that sheriffs who honor detainers violate the 4th Amendment because detainers are considered civil arrests by the sheriff, and you can't arrest people for civil matters. You can't arrest people without probable cause, and you can't arrest them unless they have judicial review. I believe strongly that our sheriff should be honoring the 4th Amendment when it comes to all inmates, including foreign nationals. He should not be arresting people who a judge has already said can be released from jail, and he should not be holding them for ICE. So, other costs. What does it cost the county? There are many litigation costs. I put up a few cases here. These are recent lawsuits against sheriffs from all over the country, and you can see they resulted in pretty significant amounts of money that the counties had to pay. But there are also costs to our community every day. When a foreign national is subject to an ICE hold, our overcrowded jail has to feed and house and take care of that person. And as I said before, they sometimes can't even pay their bail because the bail bondsman will not help out with them. So that means that we're housing them for even longer. ICE cooperation, the sheriff and ICE cooperation also costs in trust for our community. Many immigrant communities already have a distrust of law enforcement. And if law enforcement cooperates with ICE, they are less likely to call for help. They are less likely to report crimes. They are less likely to help in investigations. In 2017, when Houston began to honor ICE holds, the police saw a major reduction in the numbers of Hispanic women reporting domestic violence and sexual assault. But at the same time, domestic violence shelters saw an increase. Cities across the country saw a decline in the number of Latinos reporting crimes after Trump became president. People are really scared, and it hurts our community if people are afraid to talk to law enforcement. So in the end, though, for me, I think the greatest argument against the sheriff's policy is that it's morally wrong. I think that the way the immigration laws are enforced right now are morally wrong. And I think it is morally wrong for the sheriff to help the Trump administration deport our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Michael Montesano. Michael is going to read a letter from David in his own words.
Hello, my name is David. I'm going to tell you a bit about my situation, about what happened to me in Bloomington, Indiana. I've been living in the United States for about 19 years. I'm a family man with my wife and children. I'm the breadwinner for my family.
A bit louder, Michael, please.
One night, I didn't come home because I was arrested by police officers in Bloomington. I recognized my errors and what happened. My error was to have drunk some beers. The police stopped me. The police officer said, "You're drunk." I said, "No, I only had 2 beers." He took me to the jail to have me take the physical test, and I passed. He was going to let me go, then he spoke with the other officer, and he said to me, "Can you do a breathalyzer test?" I said, "No, can you take me to the hospital to get a blood test?" He took me to the hospital, they took blood, and he took me back to the jail again. And that was when I did the breathalyzer test. They kept me locked up for 24 hours. I stayed in jail for 24 hours hoping to get out. They didn't let me communicate with my wife to tell her what was happening. What I worried about most was whether immigration authorities would come to deport me. When my wife wanted to get me out, there couldn't be any bond because there was an ICE hold on me. 3 days later, I went to court and the judge said to me, "Why didn't you get out? You have money with you. You can pay your bond." The judge asked, "Do you have a family?" And I said, "Yes. I have a wife and 2 kids." And the judge asked if I pay rent. And I said, "No, I have a mortgage. It's my house." The judge said, "Pay the $500 downstairs and you can leave." But they took me back to the jail. Then came the most difficult and disturbing thing in my life. It was 12 a.m. when they said my name. "David, pack up your things. You're going to get out if ICE doesn't come." I got changed, I put on my shoes. They had me sign for my belongings and a check. And I was waiting by the way out. One guard looked at the other guard and they laughed. "Now you can open the door for him." And I saw the 2 men, and they came toward me and asked me my name, and I told them my name. And they asked me where I am from, and I said from Mexico. And then took out their ICE badges to show me. That was when I broke down in tears, thinking about my wife and kids, about not seeing them again in person. It was a severe blow for me and my family to live in that hell, wondering who would take my kids to school and my wife to work. I couldn't communicate with anyone. They took me to the ICE offices in Indianapolis to give more information about myself, and they wanted me to sign a form to agree to my deportation. I told them no. Then my wife went to ask for a bond to pay, and they told her that they weren't going to give me a bond. What I did inside was to ask for an immigration judge. This was the last option I had to not be separated from my family. The next day, they took me to a jail that's called Brazil, Indiana, where I stayed for 3 weeks without sleep because I was thinking about my family. When I could, I spoke with my kids and my wife, which hurt me so much in my heart. The days and nights felt like they were eternal. I asked God to protect my family while I was locked up in this hell. The days and nights went by. They moved me to another jail called McHenry, Illinois, where I spent the rest of the most desperate days of my life. I couldn't sleep or eat because I was awaiting my final day in court. My court day arrived at 11:30. I saw the judge through a video camera, and the camera moved toward my family, and the judge asked who they were, and I said my family. And then he began to read all my charges and asked if I agreed with them, and I said I did. He asked, if I set a bond of $10,000 for you, can you pay it? I told him yes, I can pay it with the help of my family. The judge let me go. I thank God that I saw my family again. They moved me again to the jail in Chicago, Illinois. Another hell for me. This was when my family went for me and paid the bond, and I got out. I hugged and kissed them so very strongly, with great happiness to see them again, and tears. I give thanks to God for everything and all who gave me moral support and psychological support and economic support. Finally, I am with my family who loves me. I love them, and I hope that we are never separated.
What's the status now?
It's deportation's pending.
Yeah, the deportation case is pending.
And now we're going to turn back to Christy, and she's going to... Oh, sorry. We're going to turn back to Christy, and she's going to provide us with some simple ideas, actions, and policies that citizens can take to try and rectify the situation.
I'm a little cynical that trying to ask the sheriff to change his policies would actually work, but that's the first thing I'm going to suggest. The sheriff can do a lot of things. He has a lot of power to stop ICE from doing their detainers, like not asking the foreign place of birth. If he does honor a warrant from ICE, he could require that it be signed by a judge, which it never will be, and that ICE reimburses the sheriff for the cost of the detainees, which they never will. But I don't think that the sheriff really will change any of his policies. I think at this point, we need to contact our other government representatives, the county council, the county commissioners, and ask them to pressure the sheriff to change this policy. Ask them to use the power of their purse to ask the sheriff to stop detaining our neighbors. We have on the table back there several templates that you can use to write letters, information about how to write letters and who to write letters to, templates for letters to the editor, and also additional information from organizations like the ACLU about what the problem with ICE detainers are and what the costs for litigation have been for many of the counties that have honored ICE holds. So I hope you get that information and inform yourselves about this issue and write the council and commissioners and urge the sheriff to change his policies.
Thank you. Now we're going to open up the floor for your questions and comments. Should be a microphone over there, or if you want to write your question down, and Gracie will pick it up and I can read it out loud. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to reinforce what Christy said. It must be 4 or 5 months ago. I'm with the Social Justice Committee at the Congregation Beth Shalom, and Diane Lemosky sat on an appeal. So I did call the sheriff, and I left a message that I was against him detaining people holding and cooperating with ICE. He called me back about 5 minutes later, very concerned that all this misinformation's going out, that he was not detaining people, except with violent crimes, which he mentioned, like the couple that starved and killed a child, or rape. And I'm very sensitive to things like rape because of Middleway House, my involvement with that. So I agree that if he's not going to be responding and he's talking to the president and says he's not doing it, then of course I'm going to go ahead and write to the county commissioners and others. I don't know when he's up for an election, but do you know when he's up for an election?
He's not running.
Yeah, that's right, he's not running yet. But anyway, I just want to confirm what Christy said, that I've already tried, and he sounded so sincere.
My question is for Christian Pop. You mentioned lawsuits happening across the country against sheriff's departments. What is the official legal precedence for the lawsuits happening against the sheriff's department, and what's the potential for that happening maybe in Bloomington as well as across our state?
So I would say the lawsuits kind of have two forms. One are citizens who have been detained, and the other are non-citizens who have been detained. Both of them are suing mostly on Fourth Amendment grounds, saying that it's an unreasonable search and seizure, or unreasonable seizure, to arrest people for ICE and hold them in jail on the basis of a detainer, because it's not a criminal arrest warrant, there's no probable cause. And most courts who have looked at this issue have been finding for the detainees, for the immigrants. Not all of them, but most of them. And the reason that they have found it unconstitutional has varied greatly depending on what has been in the complaint. But Marion County has been sued multiple times, including for detaining a citizen and non-citizens. So I think the potential is there. The problem is that many undocumented individuals do not want to bring lawsuits and come public, so that's a barrier. But if a citizen gets detained, that's more likely to be a basis.
As far as those Marion County lawsuits you just mentioned, do you know when specifically those happened, just for someone else to do research on that?
So there was one, I think in 2011, and recently there was another one that the court at the district level, there was an agreement between Marion County and the ACLU's plaintiff that agreed to not, the Marion County Jail agreed not to issue or honor detainers anymore. It went up to the 7th Circuit on appeal from the Attorney General of the state, and on procedural grounds was remanded back, partially because they said the detainee who didn't live in Marion County didn't have standing, and I think they just settled it when it went back down, so it's not pending anymore.
Okay. Thank you, appreciate it.
Again, about the election, the sheriff is in his second term and he's term limited. Is that correct?
Right.
Yes.
So when is the next sheriff's election? Do you happen to know if anyone has made an announcement that they are running? And what do you think are the prospects of making an election issue out of ICE detainers?
I don't know when, he was just elected in 2018, so I think it'll be a few years, and I don't know how long his term is. I think it's 4 years. 4 years, so. I'm hoping in 2022 we don't have ICE detainees anymore. In 2014, the Obama administration ended the Secure Communities program, which is the basis for these databases. So Obama did away with it, and Trump brought it back. So I'm hoping by 2022 it's also gone again.
I have 2 or 3 questions. First one is, during this past year, how many cases were brought before to the sheriff and how many were detained?
So we don't have the answers to that. We have done a Freedom of Information Act request with ICE. We did a public access request with the sheriff, with Monroe County. ICE responded that they didn't have that information. And I mean, there's some public information, obviously, that I was able to produce, but not anything specific here. The Monroe County Sheriff has never responded to the public access request, despite multiple reminders that they were required to under law. So we don't know. I know personally of at least 4, but there may be a lot more. And I only hear about it when someone in the community contacts me, or if a public defender tells me or defense attorney tells me that their client is being held. So I know of 4, in addition to the person who was accused of strangling her son, who is not actually being held on an ICE detainer, despite what the sheriff says, because she just didn't pay the $500,000 bail, so she wasn't eligible for release. She is not there on an ICE hold.
Thank you. The other question is, where is the ICE headquarters that deals with our prison, the sheriff?
Here in Indiana is in Indianapolis.
It's in Indianapolis. Okay. And are there any restrictions to boycott or to confront the ICE officials?
When they come to
Yeah,
Monroe County? Well, they are armed, and I think in general it probably, you can be arrested for trying to interfere with their detention of immigrants. So that would be a crime to do that. They also, as David said, pick up at 12 a.m. often, so it can be really hard. But
And the last question is, what about sanctuary centers? They can refuse to let ICE enter, I believe.
yes, so we have one sanctuary church in Bloomington, and ICE still has not said they're going to raid churches, so those tend to be safe places still.
Oh, it has to be a church, though.
Generally, they are churches just because of the special circumstances of churches. ICE said they will not raid churches, and they tend to have an additional protection.
Thank you.
Christy, will you talk about the Maryland, you know, the Baltimore case that we talked about?
Montgomery County.
Montgomery County, sorry.
Yeah, and I don't have it here, but Montgomery County, Maryland, when faced with the same questions, their county government issued a resolution, a proclamation, I don't know how they call it, either a resolution or proclamation or an executive order, to stop ICE holds in their community. And they had a lot of wonderful findings, including that ICE holds are Fourth Amendment violations, and they ordered the government officials in their community to not cooperate with ICE in violating the Fourth Amendment by honoring the detainers.
So that's a choice that local governments can make.
Yeah, and honestly, our county government does not have a lot of legislative powers. They can pass some ordinances, they have budgetary powers, and that tends to be their main power. The power of the purse.
But there is the possibility of some type of ordinance perhaps being passed, even though there's a no sanctuary law in Indiana. It doesn't prevent a local jurisdiction from placing restrictions that violate the Constitution. So I do think that there is a role for county officials in not only hoping we get a new sheriff, but placing limits on any sheriff.
So Indiana, as you said, has an anti-sanctuary law. And in the Marion County case that I was just talking about, the judge had wonderful findings, in fact, that specifically explained why the Indiana law is not violated by a policy at the jail of not cooperating by detaining people. So at least according to, this is the only court that has looked at this issue, and according to the Federal District Court, Southern District of Indiana, it is not a violation of Indiana's law for a sheriff not to detain people on an ICE detainer.
I follow your law firm on social media, and I know that the sheriff has been antagonistic to you, and I was hoping you could please summarize the ACLU lawsuit and maybe tell us what the current status is.
Yes. So the Facebook page that I put up there earlier, that was sort of the basis of it. The basis of the suit was that when the sheriff made these public comments, he also made a comment on the sheriff's website about his policy on ICE holds, which is not true, obviously, and I commented that it wasn't true. And about a week later, my comments disappeared, but all of the pro-ICE comments, the pro-policy comments stayed up. Mine disappeared. And mine only disappeared to everybody but me, right? So they were hidden. Hidden means that I could still see them, but nobody else could see them, because whoever was doing this understands that under the First Amendment, you are not allowed to delete people's comments based on viewpoint. So yes, the ACLU is representing me in a lawsuit again on First Amendment violations against the sheriff, and it's pending, but will likely be resolved with an agreed settlement.
That's interesting what you just said, because my local congressman has removed my comments any number of times on his Facebook page.
Well,
very interesting.
Is your local congressman here?
9th District.
9th District?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the rules to the First Amendment are a little complicated. Like, they can't let one side up and be deleting another side, but they cannot restrict all sides. You know, there are different things that they can do, but if pro-Hollingsworth policies are being left up and anti are being deleted, that is certainly an issue. I'm not an ACLU lawyer. I'm an immigration lawyer, but this is just my understanding.
My question, though, is initially this evening you talked about there being separations in Bloomington. So I'm wondering what impact has been had on families right now. And if you feel that some of our immigrants are being possibly followed to ascertain whether they are breaking any law, to be able to say, gotcha.
That's a really good question, and I didn't say, and I should say, the Bloomington Police Department is not cooperating with ICE, and the IU Police Department is not, to my knowledge, cooperating with ICE. It's only the Monroe County Sheriff. To my knowledge, I have not heard of such a situation where someone is followed here in Bloomington for the purpose of ascertaining their immigration status. In other parts of Indiana, it is very common for Latinos to be pulled over, and I always call it DWL, which is driving without a license or driving while Latino. And the police officers always have a reason to pull them over. Oh, you crossed the yellow line. Oh, you went through the stop sign. Oh, your rear tail light is out. And once you've heard the same story over and over and over and over, you realize that they're looking at who's driving, and they know that that person is Latino and maybe doesn't have a license.
Hi, my name is Patrick. Hello. I was wondering, I of course understand the value and the power of the purse as you were talking about, but I'm a little more drawn to people power. And so I was hoping maybe one of you two, specifically Dr. Wu with your history, if you could maybe give us some examples of people taking on these challenges themselves and maybe shed some light on what we could do as neighbors, other than just phone calls, which is not to diminish phone calls, but I was just hoping maybe you could shed some light on that.
Oh,
Or
okay.
Michael's law.
I did not expect a question. Well, you know, if I go back to the Chinese exclusion cases, actually, the Chinese. Oh, if I go back to the Chinese exclusion cases, actually, a lot of what individual people did was go through the courts, to be honest, right? And they did win some amazing victories, including securing the right to birthright citizenship for anybody born in the United States, regardless of their parents' immigration status. So that is huge, and I think we want to remember how important lawyers are. You know, lawyers who are on our side, and understanding the law and policy, which is why I so appreciate what Christy's doing. And of course, the immigrant rights movement. I am so inspired by Dreamers and DACA young people and all the folks who are advocates and allies. And I think this is a problem that has many layers, right? And so we can all find a part of it to work on together. And so I would love to hear, I guess, everybody else's ideas too.
Yeah, I would also like to chime in. Thank you for the question. I was thinking about the same thing, I think, that you were, that there are other ways to disrupt. I have seen Facebook videos published of neighborhood people disrupting, getting in the way of ICE, forming a chain, human chain, not letting people deport their neighbors. Here in the Midwest, I'm not sure which state, but I did see at least one video of people disrupting. So I think it is kind of telling that a lot of us were thinking about elections when we see that, you know, sheriff he's an elected official, but he's a problem here in Bloomington. But it's telling that we're thinking about the elections rather than thinking about we can disrupt things every single day of our lives by getting in the way of this system, which is abusing people, that we know it's doing that. Of course, you know, it depends what you can risk, what you can afford to risk. Whether you have families, whether you are invested, whether you have a career, those kinds of things. But that doesn't prevent people from, you know, screwing stuff up, to put it politely.
If I can follow up on that, there is a national group called Never Again, and their motto is Never Again is Now. And if you go to their website, they have been disrupting ICE actions all over the country. They're extremely well organized. They're young, they're very thoughtful, and they do trainings and other kinds of tutorials if you want to organize in your own community.
Can I say the obvious is historically, all you have to do is read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And there's a book of primary documents and songs and manifestos and trials called Voices of a People's History of the United States, which is by Howard Zinn and Anthony Arnaud, my son. And there's also a documentary with the History Channel called The People Speak.
Thank you very much for this evening. It's been very informative. I'm wondering what we know about the facilities in Brazil, Indiana, and what kind of conditions people are being held, and are there opportunities to interact with and support detainees in Brazil, Indiana? I don't have a full answer for you, but it is a county jail, and the county jail has a contract with ICE to house their detainees while they're pending relocation to another ICE detention facility. So immigrant detainees, no matter if they were picked up because they were a murderer or if they were just picked up in an ICE raid or whatever the case might be, they are housed with the criminal population in Clay County. And the conditions are jail conditions. And this speaks to a bigger issue, which we don't have time for today. But certainly, the way we treat immigrant detainees is despicable. We treat them like they're worse than criminals. And in fact, they haven't broken any criminal law most of the time. So it's a bigger issue than we can discuss here today. I don't know how to support them. I know it's very, like most jails, it's very hard to get in unless you have approved visitation.
It would be interesting to find out what does Monroe County have in terms of support for people who are undocumented or say in the process of maybe gaining legal status, but it's up in the air where they could become undocumented. And because that's kind of like it's like, where is that? Where is that? You know, we are having this conversation right now about the things that the sheriff are doing and things that the sheriff shouldn't be doing, the things that the sheriff are not doing. But how is this community and this crowd supporting people that are here and experiencing things even before they even get to the place where they're criminalized, they enter into the jail? Because people are all around us who are undocumented, people are all around us who are, you know, experience this where there is a fear because of the current atmosphere as to the president. So I think it's good to identify specifics as to how people who are in these situations can receive these help. Whether it's their people, their family are in the jail, how is the family being supported? How are they being supported even though they're in the jail? Those kind of specifics are things that should be identifiable and should be publicized so that it can be seen as a source where people can go to, a direction for people to seek help. Because we do want change on the upper level in terms of these people who are causing these people to suffer more, but we also want to be able to create a community where the people who are experiencing these things can see that even though some might think they don't belong, there's some that think that they do, and they have support in the community.
That's an excellent point. I will, since we are being recorded, throw out a few organizations that are here that can be helpful. Undocu Hoosiers is a really great one that Michael Smith. Bloomington Refugee Support Network is another one, and I know both of those organizations, to the extent that they can, help people both monetarily, with emotional support, with getting to wherever they need to go, and are often relied upon by people who are at risk with their immigration status. There are different legal organizations. El Centro Comunal Latino, which is here in the library, is a fantastic organization that provides support to primarily Latinos, but they are also open their doors to any immigrants who come in.
Yeah, thank you for the shout out also, Christy. Yeah, so I would mention Dr. Hoosiers Bloomington, myself and Co, we were involved in planning this event. We are, as an organization, we are meeting on the IU campus. We also, the Refugee Support Network is also very important. On our website, that is undocumented-.
Undocumented.btown-in.org.
Yes, there we do have also a list of resources, not only scholarships or financial help for people who need processing fees for legal, because it's, you know, legal fees, but also just the basic support resources that are here in Bloomington, such as food banks, mental health resources, and other community kinds of things that anyone can utilize, but do impact significantly undocumented people here in Monroe. And religious organizations do make a very significant impact as well. Various religious organizations are helping if their parts of their congregation are undocumented and struggling for whatever reason.
And I'm just going to add to that, Monroe County United Ministries, Salvation Army, St. Vincent de Paul, all work with people who are in need of help with rent or utilities. People who are undocumented cannot go to the trustee for help with rent or utilities, but these other agencies are able to help. So that's important to know.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the sheriff associations, that there are, because the sheriff associations, of course, are aware of litigation and aware of problems, and have they taken any sort of stand on these kinds of issues, ICE holds and that whole area?
Yeah, so in general, the sheriff's associations have been pro-ICE holds. They see immigration enforcement as a criminal enforcement job, and they honor ICE, they encourage sheriffs to honor ICE holds. This came up in North Carolina, where many of the sheriffs themselves were against ICE holds. The legislature tried to pass a law to require ICE holds, require honoring ICE holds, and the Sheriff's Association was trying to encourage that as well. The governor vetoed the legislation, but my understanding is most sheriff's associations are pro-ICE hold.
And what was the reason the governor vetoed? Did he give a reason?
Many people. I think it was just that there was a lot of people that were against it, including many of the sheriffs themselves.
But litigation, I mean, because I'm just wondering how these things can hold up.
Yeah, I don't know all of that detail.
I just want to make a comment about how supporting people. We tried in the past to connect with people who were at risk of being deported. And what we found was they weren't willing to come forward to ask for our help. And I don't know how we don't know when ICE is coming. And unless we know that, we can't be there to support them. And so how we do that, it's been a difficult thing to do. We try. And I wish there were a way. I think it's because there's fear. And I think it's the more hidden I stay, the better it's going to be, even if it is a group of people I think I can trust. I don't know, you might know. And so we can't form a barrier between them and ICE because we don't know who they are and we don't know when ICE is coming. At least that's my opinion. I don't know whether I'm right or not, but so you might know.
Well, can I mention something? Just to say that since I work in one of these organizations, El Centro Comunal Latino, where we have people that come to us when they have issues, things they're trying to figure out, as well as for other reasons. But so when a person has a court date, that's a lot of the times that you'll see somebody saying, "Hey, can you accompany me?" And of course, usually you need to speak Spanish, and that's because they're scared to be there. ICE can go in, they can't go into a courtroom and arrest somebody, but they can detain them out in the hall. And that happened once. I don't know if it's happened more than that in Bloomington or in Monroe County. But if people are Spanish speakers, really it's because also you're helping them understand how the system works a bit, which is, hardly anybody knows until you go through it. So that's just another idea.
Any other questions?
Well, we thank you again for your